All right, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again. Checkbox Podio, coming to you from West Virginia. Well, I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to do a recording today. I'm a little bit under the weather, and if you might hear me periodically cough once or twice during the duration of this recording, but tomorrow I'll be at the airport and I wouldn't be able to record for a while. And I really wanted to talk about the case of Cindy James. This is a death that goes back to 1989 from a place called Richmond, British Columbia. This is in Canada. I first found out about this case back in 2017, and because of the horrific details surrounding the death of Cindy Jan, I thought when they said Richmond, they meant Richmond, Virginia. I wasn't really thinking too much about location, but no, this is Richmond, British Columbia. So, and the reason why is because this is one of the most horrific kind of true crime, what happened sort of cases. And horrific in the psychological sense, not necessarily in the course of actions, but the kind of terror that was inflicted upon a person. What happened to Cindy James was we mentioned that she passed away in 1989 after 7 years of being terrorized by somebody. This all started after she experienced the divorce with her husband, Roy Makepeace, who was a practicing psychiatrist. And I believe Roy Makepeace is now also deceased. He passed away in the early part of the new millennium. He was at least 19 years older than her, and there were some controversial things revolving around their marriage, like the divorce from Roy Makepeace's first wife and the very quickly marrying Cindy James. Also, Cindy was born Cindy Hack, Hack, and she actually changed her name to James because of someone was stalking her, terrorizing her, leaving very crazy voicemails and messages that were cut out of like newspaper clippings where they take the letters and they arrange them in particular order. But the thing about it is, no one can tell is she telling the truth or not. Did she do this to herself and cause her own death and create this as a fiction? Why would they say that? Well, the police were contacted numerous times about this. And the thing is, though, when the police were doing their 24-hour surveillance, absolutely no activity. And also, there's some kind of interesting things that we have going on with Cindy's own personal behavior. There's an excellent presentation on this case from the Lorden Arts channel, hosted by John Lorden, the show Brain Scratch. He did a very nice presentation. He does very good research. I had seen that one in 2017, but when I was getting back into this case, I watched that and I was like, overwhelmingly, I was just like, she was murdered by her ex husband. I mean, 4 months after their divorce, it's like a psychiatrist's ex wife suddenly becomes psychologically terrorized. I just had this overwhelming feeling, that she was murdered by her ex husband, that he was the one doing this to her. But there are some other things going on. There's another side of the story. Is that just what Cindy wanted us to think? There's another channel out here on YouTube called Bedtime Stories. I don't know the name of the host, but he does some rather nice I guess you'd call it podcast, YouTube videos, whatever you'd like to call it. And when I saw his, instantly I was like, "Oh crap. I take it back. She did it to herself. Cindy did something that caused her own death." Well, what really happened to Cindy James back in 1989? Bear in mind that this is a 7 year time of when someone's just being terrorized, harassed, receiving very strange messages. And one of the big things, though, with this case, what really kind of caught my attention is multiple times Cindy passed out and woke up in weird positions, woke up naked. One time she even woke up with a paring knife stabbed through her hand. And it's like, how would someone be able to do that to themselves? Like, why on earth would anyone think that this is somebody who is doing it to themselves? Like, how on earth could you take a knife and stab it through your own hand? And please don't try that at home based on that's not a suggestion. It's more just like a mental exercise. But it's like, how do we get to that conclusion? How do we get any conclusion in this, really? Well, what I would say about this particular case is I've been reading some other things about there's a very website called melaniehack.com, and this is mostly promoting a book called, what's it called? Who Killed My Sister, My Friend. like comma, my sister, my friend, and that's written by Melanie Hack, who was the sister of Cindy James. And she has an excerpt of the book that is up there for free. And once again, melaniehack.com. I love it when people sort of put up the free chapters and such. And because one thing, I believe it was the guy on Bedtime Stories, it was maybe a different YouTuber, was saying something like, we always have to remember that we didn't know Cindy James personally. Well, and like, we didn't know her personally, so we can't make too many comments about what was she really like. Is she the type of person that would concoct this kind of far out scenario, a 7 year ordeal where she's being terrorized, assaulted, stripped naked, always has black pantyhose tied around her neck? Pantyhose or nylons? Alright, in case you cannot tell, I'm kind of like a dude or something. I don't know what the difference between pantyhose and nylons are. Yeah, but it's one or the other. Maybe they're the same thing. They're tied around her neck. And some people were thinking that that's actually the signature of a perpetrator. The Lord and Arts upload that I recommended, he asked a brilliant question when he was like, well, did anybody know if they were her nylons or did they belong to somebody else? Like does a I mean, did they come from her wardrobe? Were there any comments about that? And there's one thing we'll say about that as we go on down the line. But it's like, what really is the possibility that someone would terrorize themselves? Why? Like, what on earth would be the motivation? I understand you get divorced, but when you get divorced, why would you terrorize yourself? Like, what could be the motivation for that? Well, one theory that actually comes to us from Roy Makepeace is that Cindy James had dissociative identity disorder, in the sense that multiple personalities. He was, if we view him as not a suspect, but like a medical professional, I'm kind of 50-50 on that now. Because one of the big things we need to remember is how Cindy actually died. As far as we know, she died from morphine overdose and strangulation. She was found near an abandoned house, tied up. Her hands were tied behind her back, hands tied to her feet, like being hog-tied. And people were just like, well, how on earth could you do that? And somebody at the trial, like they actually conducted a hearing, not really a trial, but a hearing to determine the cause of death. And they brought in a not expert. And I've heard like some conflicting stories about this not expert. For some reason, like one of them says that he was able to tie himself up. He was able to hog tie himself the way she did in 3 minutes, but he used different knots. And then there was also another time when Cindy was found. Remember, this happened multiple times that she was found like naked or kind of disrobed and tied up. One time, I believe, he actually said that he could not replicate those knots. Like he couldn't tie himself up in the way that she was found. But there's a big thing to say. Cindy had something in her stomach, which was a lot of morphine capsules. We're talking 10 times the lethal limit of morphine. And there was also a puncture mark in her arm, but no needles were present, no needles were found around the scene. What's that significant of? It's like, that's something that's very difficult to explain, and that might be the key to the case. Because, in case I didn't mention it before, Cindy was actually a nurse. She was a pediatric nurse, and she would have had, like substantial knowledge about things of that nature. She would have had like more knowledge than a layperson. And on one of the forums I was reading, somebody was mentioning that they were a medical professional, and they were just saying that it is ridiculous to try and commit suicide by ingesting morphine capsules, or just like the concept of ingesting morphine orally. It is so improbable that it's actually going to kill you. I mean, most people can be resuscitated from something like that. And a lot of people were looking at that individual's comment, and they were just like, wait a second, something's starting to connect. Question mark, but no needle found. Well, the big difference between a needle and taking morphine orally is that she might have had as much as 30 minutes before the morphine kicked into her system, incapacitated. Whereas if she had done it with a needle, it would have happened much quicker. But the problem is, though, I mentioned Cindy's body was found by an abandoned house, right? Well, where was her car found? A mile and a half away. I mean, maybe if you walk really fast, you can walk a mile and a half in 30 minutes. I guess so. You'd have to walk at a brisk pace. Yeah, I mean, I think that you can roughly do that, but you'd have to be walking very quickly. I mean, I've, walked like 2 miles in 45 minutes before. So that's a big theory that they're going with now. Well, if that's the case, what do you make of the puncture mark? With a puncture mark on her arm. Well, the theory that they were going with on that forum was Cindy injected herself with the syringe, kind of just like, excuse me, kind of just like a pinprick. And it really wasn't the fatal dose of morphine that went in there. She kind of just pricked the skin, and then she wanted people to think that she had been injected with morphine. So there's no possible way that she could have done it. But at the same, and then, like, she might have survived the morphine that was in her stomach, meaning that she had done it to herself. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean that Dr. Roy Makepeace's theory is correct? That Cindy had some sort of kind of multiple personality, Munchild syndrome or something? Munchild syndrome, of course, when you're kind of bringing destruction intentionally onto someone or yourself for attention. And is this just somebody who suffered a very bad divorce and didn't respond very well to that? Or is this the result of a psychiatrist who very cleverly and very easily, with his sort of knowledge and background, knew how to terrorize someone? Well, this story just gets weirder and weirder. This is why I mentioned that it's like, it's so just bizarre psychologically, because we have a third suspect, and the guy from Bedtime Stories didn't look at either example that I had put forward, my kind of gut instincts, that Cindy was murdered by Dr. Roy Makepeace, her ex husband, or that Cindy committed an accidental death or possible suicide. He entertains the theory that there was an individual named Pat McBride who was an officer in British Columbia, police officer that is, and he moved into her house for a month and had a romantic relationship with Cindy. And that guy was saying he's the most likely suspect. And like on the Lord and Arts channel, they were just like they were saying that the police officer moved into the house. What's up with that? As far as I know, Pat McBride was not the one who was assigned to her case. It's like, she just developed a relationship with a police officer and he moved into the house. I think that that's actually correct. You might find something that he was the officer that was supposed to be watching her and then they developed a relationship, which may have happened, but I remember like one of the other sites was saying very clearly that he was not. He was just, somebody who was a member of the police force that she started dating. And, she brought him into the house and they lived together for a month. But that's a giant red flag. Like, who lives with somebody for only 1 month? Does that mean that something bad happened that caused him to move out? I mean, does that mean that there was something about some sort of conflict between this guy McBride and Cindy James? I'm not too sure about that, but I can say that my gut instincts definitely push us toward one of the two possible theories that we mentioned before, that this was the work of Dr. Makepeace, Cindy's ex husband, or that Cindy was undergoing some sort of psychological trauma. And she was either slipping into multiple personalities or some sort of blackout phase. I mean, if you'd like to call that a multiple personality, some sort of like blackout where she just wouldn't be aware of her actions. I don't necessarily know how to describe it in any other way. Because there are other things, though. One of Cindy's cats was murdered. Her basement was set on fire while there were family members in the house. Her family insists that she was murdered. And once again, the title of the book is, Who Killed My Sister and My Friend, by, once again, Melanie Hack, Hack. And they don't seem very convinced that Cindy did this to herself. But one of the things that I probably should have mentioned at the beginning is Cindy was a rather secretive person, from what I've gathered, that she had a fiance once and her engagement broke up, but she didn't tell her family until after the engagement was already over. They had no idea that she was in a relationship at all. So, what do we make of that? Is Cindy just someone who is a little bit different, a little bit reserved, a little bit quirky, and that kind of the situation got exacerbated after her divorce, and her mental state deteriorated? Then that led her to start committing these destructive acts. But wait, there's more. Cindy hired a private investigator, which she could barely afford him, but his name was Ozzy, but I always forget his last name. There are two A's in it, but I'll just call him Ozzy, the private investigator. He strongly believes that Cindy James did not commit suicide, that this was not an accidental death or psychological trauma. And the reasons that he says for this, people were sending Cindy letters with, cut up pieces of newspaper and magazines, arranging like cut out letters in order. And then Ozzy was going through Cindy's trash without her knowledge, and he never once found any cut up magazines or newspapers that would fit that description. Furthermore, the paring knife incident. I totally believe that a human would not stab a paring knife through their hand. I mean, there was one case on 48 Hours where it's like they were accusing a guy once of murdering his wife and then staging the scene by taking like a harpoon, I kid you not, a harpoon or a long spear, and stabbing it through his leg twice as, like staging the scene. And the doctors were just like, maybe a schizophrenic on PCP could have done that, but, the average person does not take long, sharp objects, or any blade really, and just stab themselves right through the hand. And I believe that Cindy was stabbed so hard that the knife stayed in her hand, and there was actually a note that was going through the blade of a knife resting on top. I would say though, I mean, yeah, okay, some people are superhuman, but when you hear a description like that, what that tells me is if she did indeed do it to herself, she was either under the influence of a very strong substance, which Cindy would have had knowledge about being a nurse, or she would actually had something that Dr. Makepeace was talking about. And once again, if we view him as a medical expert and not a suspect, what he's saying might actually have some sort of value. It might actually have some sort of merit that she could have possibly been experiencing a multiple personality disorder or some type of Munchausen syndrome, something where she would have blacked out and lost awareness of what she was doing so she wouldn't feel the pain inflicted upon her. We mentioned the private investigator, Ozzy, and once again, I'm sorry I can't remember his last name, I never can, but it's like when it comes to private investigator Ozzy, he also says that Cindy did not own the black nylons that were always found around her neck. Multiple times, at least 3 or 4 times, she was found outside. One time she was found naked with black nylons tied around her neck. She was found with the nylons around her neck when they found her with the paring knife through her hand. And of course, she was found with nylons tied around her neck when she was deceased. And an interesting thing about the discovery of the body, we mentioned that it was by an abandoned house, 1.5 miles from where her car was parked at a shopping center. No syringes in sight, but the body was not found for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of decomposition, 2 weeks of, like sitting out there in the sun. And this wasn't the winter. My first instinct was, what was the season? I mean, we're talking about December, covered in snow, maybe? No, this was in May. And so it's like, that's another thing that Ozzy says is a critical point of evidence, such as it was a very, very busy area. Why didn't anybody find her for 2 weeks? He personally believes that Cindy was murdered and that the body was dumped there. He believes that somebody kept her in a different place for a little while and they dumped the body at that site. Because even though the house was abandoned, it was frequented very often by teenagers for kind of like house parties and such. I'm not sure what to make of that. I mean, we have bodies that are in, like, sitting for months or years before they are discovered, right? Especially near bodies of water. I mean, which Cindy wasn't near one, but I mean, just so many times. Like, you think about the smiley face killers theory, Manchester Canals theory, as well as some other things like Henry McCabe. The bodies are in the water for months. Could the same thing kind of have happen if we were like kind of just on land? Because she wasn't found like on a sidewalk or something. She was found in the bushes. But I kind of do agree with Ozzy's assessment that it's very much in plain sight. Like you could notice that very easily, but perhaps it just she did indeed sit there 2 weeks, perhaps not. I wish I had a definitive answer for that. Don't ever really hold back the theory that I go with. For a long time, I was just completely divided about this one. And then I mentioned when I saw the Lord Norts upload, I was like, it was her ex-husband. He did these horrible things to her. And then I was like, wait a second, when I saw the bedtime stories one, no, she staged the scene. Cindy did this. Motivation, I'm not sure. Mental illness, I'm not sure. But Cindy did this. And I was just going back and forth. But I think there's an enormous amount of merit in that theory that was put forward on that forum talking about kind of the medical issues. Cindy could have ingested the morphine capsules herself. We're talking about taking morphine orally, thinking that it would not kill her. And she completely set the scene up. But, I mean, I can't prove that. That's kind of the thing that I lean toward the most. And it's like a staging thing with the pinprick. Excuse me for that one. I warned you guys though. And it's also like, I also thought of one way she could have disposed of the needle would be just pricked her skin with it and thrown it away in the shopping center parking lot. Those things always have trash cans. It could have happened that way. It really could have. And they wouldn't necessarily know to look for her there through those trash cans if the body was found, a mile and a half away. So anyway, well, that's kind of something that I'm leaning toward. I know the family is completely against that, and we mentioned that there is a very good argument that the live-in boyfriend slash detective, Sam McBride, Pat McBride, excuse me. Well, I'm almost out of gas here, if you can hear from my voice, so we'll have to wrap this thing up soon. Pat McBride, the detective, where it's like, I can understand that possibility that he would have. I mean, he would have been involved with this. It makes a lot of sense. It also makes sense why there was no newspapers cut up in the trash, why the nylons were coming from a different place, why. Well, here's a big one. One time, Cindy had a panic button installed in her house, so she could just hit it in case she was being terrorized. The intruder disabled it. Pat McBride probably would have known how to do that. He probably would have had some familiarity with some systems, and I mean, I'm still very divided about this one. It sounds like an absolutely horrific experience, and my voice is a little sore, so excuse me, but we also have the famous voicemail where they say, Cindy, dead meat, soon. And a lot of people think that that's actually a voicemail that was left to Cindy. It's a thread. It says, Cindy, dead meat soon. But people think that that's a woman, and that's actually one of Cindy's multiple personalities. Or, once again, we talked about some other psychological issue going on that is making the sounds. Because apparently all the creepy voicemails she received were from a female voice. So, who knows what that could be? What do you think about Cindy Jane?